Wild creatures, seeds planted in holy soil. This is a service about wildness and about bringing that forming edge, our tender forming edge with all of its fears and vulnerabilities, bringing our wildness to that edge. Nasrudin, another time, was asked, sitting, for some reason in this story, he's sitting on a pile of bananas. I don't know why, but he's sitting there and somebody comes and asks him, Nasrudin, how does one attain wisdom? Because he's not only the trickster, he's a very wise man. And Nasrudin says, wisdom, good judgment. And the questioner responds, well, then how does one attain good judgment? And Nasrudin says, experience. And the questioner asks once more, where does one get experience? And Nasrudin, imagine looking him in the eye, bad judgment. This tender, vulnerable, forming edge of becoming. We are in the midst of the holy month of Ramadan, the 9th month of the Islamic calendar, when Muslims from around the world commemorate the first revelation of Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Observing Ramadan, it's one of the 5 pillars of Islam, you might know, and in its essence, like 4 of the 5, it's not about belief, but about practice, about taking the 28 days of the lunar month to fast during the day, to set aside time for contemplation and prayer. And if you've ever fasted, for whatever reason, religious or medical appointment or whatever, you know what happens. You get cranky, usually. Hangry, the kids are calling it, that unique form of anger that comes from being hungry. And we get hangry or cranky because we are feeling, I think, vulnerable. Fasting leads us to our vulnerability. Ramadan brings people in contact with an essential kind of weakness. The friends I've had who've celebrated, recognized Ramadan have talked about feeling weak through the day and waiting for that moment after sunset of iftar to break the fast and feel revived again. Weakness, it's not an easy thing to feel. It's not easy to feel weak in a world that tells you never to show your weakness. Not easy to feel weak in a culture built on a paradigm of domination. Not easy to feel weak when we know all too well the dangers we may daily face. And so many of us, most of us, maybe all of us have well-developed protectors who keep us from feeling the weakness that's residing somewhere down deep in our bellies. Protectors who organize our lives, who rationalize feelings or keep us focused on tasks, who flare with hard defensive feelings to protect us from the more vulnerable states underneath. Those states which without our protectors might be intolerable. So between our protectors and the options our culture offers for anesthetizing ourselves to the discomfort, even pain of feeling our vulnerability, we can go long stretches, years or even decades, without really feeling it. Operating in a sort of half-alive state of habitual functioning. But despite our well-developed protectors, weakness is our original state. We are all born wildly vulnerable, wholly dependent. And that vulnerable core doesn't actually go away, right? We just learn. And this is what I'm coming to understand as spiritual maturation, or what family systems theory names differentiation, is all about. Learning how to care for that vulnerable center, for our own vulnerable center, without disconnecting from ourselves or from others. And this learning, it can only happen when we are aware of our sacred vulnerability, in touch, connected to that holy place of weakness within. He says every one of us is a child, every one of us is ancient, every one of us has a body. He says every one of us is frightened. He says every one of us has to find a way to live with fear. And so in Ramadan, Muslims fast, choose to expose the tender belly to the raw force of hunger, and through that exposure to get viscerally in touch with a primal vulnerability. And whenever I'm thinking about vulnerability, I turn to our great contemporary wisdom teacher, Brene Brown, who says, if we're going to find our way out of shame, one of those protectors, although it's one of those layers in between, we often have a protector over that protector, one way out of shame and back to each other, vulnerability is the path, and courage is the light. She says to set down those lists of what we're supposed to be is brave. To love ourselves and support each other in the process of becoming real. To love and support each other in the process of becoming real is perhaps the greatest single act of daring greatly. That's from the book Daring Greatly. Vulnerability is the path and courage is the light. Vulnerability is the path, courage the light. And maybe it was because it was Earth Day this week, or maybe it's that it's just spring and I've been spending time watching seedlings emerge in the neighborhood gardens, but I think of the courage of the new sprout, or the freshly grown uncurling leaf. Not a choiceful courage, but the simple courage required of life, the simple courage of taking the path toward the light. To grow, it is necessary to expose the tender forming edge to the raw elements, to the unpredictable forces of the world. Growth happens on the vulnerable forming edge. On the vulnerable forming edge, we get wounded and have the chance to learn to care for ourselves more fully. On that vulnerable forming edge, we find the world greeting us with our next horizon. He says, look forward to getting old. He says, keep changing. You just get more who you really are. He says, get stuck, accept it, repeat yourself as long as it is interesting. He says, keep doing what you love. In experiential education, which was a big piece of my path before ministry and during, but in experiential education, we talk about learning happening when you get outside your comfort zone. It's from actually the work of a psychologist, Lev Vygotsky, who developed a model we called the learning zone. And it adds another layer of complexity to this. So imagine 3 concentric circles. You might have heard me mention this before. The smallest circle is the comfort zone. We actually need to spend most of our time there, taking care of our daily habits and routines, allowing ourselves to rest, recharge, reflect. But life will continually tug on us to leave. It will lure us or sometimes hurl us out of that comfort zone. And outside that first circle, just outside the first step, is the learning zone or growth zone. You can imagine that second concentric circle. But then beyond that next ring is a third layer in the model, the panic zone. The panic zone is about responding to immediate threats to protect survival. It's not about learning and growth. Growth cannot happen when we're in the panic zone. Panic zone is when our protectors come out in full force, going on defense or out on attack or numbing and paralyzing us. We respond in a crisis in the panic zone. It's how most of us were functioning over a year or so ago, adapting to circumstances, but not necessarily learning, growing in that moment of extreme crisis. We're coming up on another transition. And my hope for us in this transition is that we can move as we have to out of our comfort zone, but not out into the panic zone, to stay in that tender edge of becoming those unfolding, uncurling leaves in the growth zone. And then this week, the conviction of Derek Chauvin brought me in touch, I think many of us in touch with the tender forming edge of our society, the pursuit of justice, growing toward justice in the face of generation upon generation of injustice. As I listened to the coverage of the verdict on Tuesday, I heard leader after leader remark that this verdict provided accountability, but not justice, was a relief, but not a celebration. A relief in the aftermath of a video that showed for 9 minutes and 29 seconds the raw, desperate vulnerability, not just of George Floyd, but of a people. A video that gave the lie once again to our deep-seated cultural myth of the dangerous Black man who is unable to feel pain, who needs to be subdued and controlled. And the leader I've turned to most to understand the dynamics going on is Resmaa Menakem. I've mentioned him before. He's a therapist, a trauma specialist who's written profoundly about how racialized and ancestral trauma shapes all of our bodies, all of our lives in this society. I've mentioned this book, My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. Resmaa, he comes from a family of police officers and has brought his healing work to police departments and activist collectives alike. One thing he often says is that just as trauma decontextualized in a person can look like personality, trauma in a people can look like culture. And his argument, which I think is one of the most useful ways of thinking about how to heal the core wound of racism in our society, is that we are all holding racialized trauma in our bodies, passed down generation to generation with roots in the paradigm of domination culture in Europe, preceding even the first crews that voyaged to Africa and brutally enslaved and dehumanized the people they encountered. There's a lot there. I'm not going to get into his whole explanation today, but suffice to say, all of us are holding a piece of this inherited trauma. But of course, in very different ways, depending on the color of our skin, depending on the family and community we come from. And the way to heal this trauma, like healing any trauma, Menakem teaches, is to feel what he calls clean pain. When we feel dirty pain, we don't take responsibility for it. We blame others, we lash out, we blow the trauma we are holding in our own bodies through other bodies. We're in the panic zone, and our protectors work to keep us from feeling the pain buried deep inside. This is how trauma is transmitted generation to generation. To feel clean pain and actually heal the trauma requires us to soothe and settle those protectors so that they will grant access to our more vulnerable places where the pain, where the trauma is stored. This is the other option, to feel our vulnerability and in it to move through clean pain so that time and spirit can do their work. Thinking about the trial, the verdict this week, I couldn't stop thinking, I don't wish prison the way it currently exists on our society. I don't wish it on Derek Chauvin or anyone. I'm convinced that our punitive justice system serves much more often to perpetuate the cycle of trauma than to heal it. But I do believe accountability can be a path to feeling clean pain and beginning the process of healing, of bringing the tender forming edge in contact with the light that new growth may unfurl. And I wonder, can we imagine what new growth might unfurl when we are able to stop thinking white bodies are vulnerable and need protection from dangerous black bodies? That white bodies are the ones who are vulnerable and black bodies impervious to pain and dangerous. So here's my theory. All of the great challenges we face, from systemic racism to all other facets of domination culture, to the ravages of the industrial society and our climate catastrophe, all of the great challenges we face require us to lean toward the world with our tender forming edge, to trust in the wisdom of vulnerability, allow it to sensitively alert us when we're headed to the panic zone, allow ourselves to bravely move toward the light and expand in the discomfort of the growth zone. And I want to offer two simple next step, the one right in front of you, opportunities to do just that coming up in the life of our community. Many of us are reading or will read a book that Linda Klein has facilitated a process to choose. It's called The Art of Dying Well. The first discussion is tomorrow night. It's not too late to join. The book by Katie Butler is another invitation to lean into vulnerability, the vulnerability of aging, of having a body that will get sick and die. Butler calls out again the way in which our culture would encourage us to keep this holy weakness of our body, this intimate vulnerability, out of mind, to anesthetize, to fix symptoms with medicines that may cause greater ills. And instead, she invites us to move toward our own fragility with care and compassion. And she has a lot of practical suggestions to do so. Join Linda and others tomorrow night, and you'll be invited to reflect on how you think about your own death and about what our church can do to enhance this aging and dying experience we all face for our members. So that's one opportunity. The other is to sit down in listening circles once again. That first year that I was with you, we had a series of hopes and histories conversations, history of your congregation, your own history with this community, and our hopes for the future. We're going to have a similar process, calling it Building a New Way. I invite you to sign up for one of these gatherings, to sit, to hear from one another, to hear about who we are and who we are becoming from one another. The questions we'll ask are before the pandemic, what did you value most about our congregation, about you, Marin? Ground ourselves in memory. And then during this past year, what have you appreciated about our response to COVID, how we've dealt with this time? And then what concerns weigh on you about how things are going? What concerns weigh on you about your own life, about your family or loved ones, or in our broader community? And out of all of that, looking forward, how do you envision us reemerging? What do you hope that our return to normal will look like? What do you hope won't return to normal? What do you hope will change from our experience this past year? Let's dwell together. Allow those tender vulnerabilities of our concerns to lead us toward the light, toward a path with pale ground just illumined. It matters that you care. It matters that you feel. It matters that you notice. It matters that life lives through you. Start right now. Take a small step. A small step you can call your own. Don't follow someone else's heroics. Be humble and focused. Start close in. Don't mistake that other for your own. Start close in. Don't take the second step or the third. Start with the first thing close in. The step you don't want to take. May it be so.